Welcome to everyone to this final session of International Law Weekend 2021 and to this panel entitled 20 Years After 9/11, the Fall of Afghanistan. I'm David Stewart and I'll be the moderator and welcome you all to our panel. As we all know, after the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban this past August, the country faces quite a number of significant crises. At the same time that the Taliban leadership works to gain international acceptance and recognition as the new government of the country, it certainly appears that many abuses continue, and members of civil society and human rights activists worldwide are calling for the international community to take strong steps to ensure the protection of fundamental human rights, civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, and in particular, the rights of women and minorities in the country. The question for this panel is what options are available to the international community to give concrete expression to those concerns and to provide effective assistance to those who are most affected within the country. This question has a number of different aspects, of course. In the interest of time, but without intending to confine the discussion, we have sought to focus on three of those questions in particular. The first would be a fairly straightforward question of international law. Should the international community formally decline to recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan? Such a decision might lead various governments around the world to decline to establish formal relationships with the new government, not to do business with them, or even perhaps to oppose their participation in the UN or in other international bodies because they are not the legitimate government. And if that course of action is pursued, if that's what would be the consequences? What might be the alternatives? That's the first question. Second one, much broader, how can international law help to protect the rights of women in Afghanistan? Or perhaps even more broadly, what might the international community do to help the people of Afghanistan? As you may know, Afghanistan remains a party to the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's been a party since 2003. It's also a party to the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, as well as to the two fundamental covenants, one on civil and political rights, one on economic and social and cultural rights. Also a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And until last year, it was a member of, had done a term, at least one term, as a member of the UN Human Rights Council. And still, of course, even though it's not a member of the council, is required to submit its reports as part of the universal periodic review process. So the question here would be, do these various mechanisms or others in the UN system offer viable, meaningful, useful alternatives for calling the Taliban to account and bringing pressure to bear? So that's a second question. A third one, I hope that our panelists will endeavor to get into, is what's the importance of the pending investigation by the International Criminal Court into atrocity crimes in Afghanistan? And might that also have a positive effect? Now, for some of you who may not be following that particular issue, I'll give you just a short background. The investigation in a preliminary form was begun by then prosecutor Fatou Bensouda in November of 2017. And in March 2020, the appeals chamber of the ICC formally authorized the prosecutor to begin an investigation into atrocity crimes, those falling within the scope of Article 5 of the Rome Statute. You may remember that because it appeared it would also touch on actions of the United States government within the country, it did gain some political criticism, some concern. And the Afghan government itself sought to defer the investigation on the grounds that it was conducting its own investigation. In light of the events this past August, the current prosecutor, Karim Khan, concluded there's no longer any realistic prospect of a genuine and effective domestic investigation into crimes under Article 5 of the Rome Statute. And he filed an application for an expedited order from the pretrial chamber to resume the investigation. Earlier this month, the judges in pretrial chamber 2 asked the UN Secretary General formally for information on who represents Afghanistan in international bodies following the Taliban's accession to power. The request obviously is intended to clarify the status of the new leadership as the judges prepare to rule on the prosecutor's request to resume the investigation. In their written ruling, the judges said, and here I'll quote, "For several reasons, including the fast pace of recent developments and the short time elapsed since they materialized, there is still a large margin of uncertainty as to the legal implications of those events, including for purposes of international law and international relations." I don't believe we've had any indication of how the Secretary General may deal with that question, but obviously the answer has implications for that first question that I posed. So these are 3 framework questions. They're not intended to confine our discussion, but maybe just to give it a little bit of structure. I'm delighted that we have 3 very knowledgeable and distinguished panelists to begin the discussion. The Honorable Fawzia Koofi, who is joining us from Paris, is a former member of the Afghan parliament. In fact, she served as vice president of the National Assembly and was a member of the Afghan delegation engaged in the effort to negotiate peace with the Taliban that took place in Doha. It's long been her priority to defend and promote women's rights in Afghanistan. And her autobiographical memoir entitled "The Favored Daughter: One Woman's Fight to Lead Afghanistan into the Future" was published in 2013, and I can see that it's still readily available on Amazon. And she'll, as I say, be joining us from Paris, and we'll talk about, in particular, I think, the issues of women's rights and humanitarian crisis. We also are joined by Dr. David Donat Catton, who's joining from Rome. This is a truly international panel. He's a legal scholar and human rights activist who has worked at the Parliamentarians for Global Action for over 20 years, recently assumed responsibilities as its Secretary General. Also an adjunct professor of international law at NYU's Center of Global Affairs. He's formerly lectured on the faculty of the law school in Salzburg on international criminal law, on the faculty at the University of Teramo in Italy, and has written in the area several important books. We're delighted to have you, Professor Catton. And finally, we have someone that you've all had occasion to meet during our International Law Weekend, and that's Rukhsar Azami, who's a former Afghan journalist who fled the nation a number of years ago. In addition to her service with the branch, for which we're just delighted as our media officer, she's pursuing her master's degree at NYU in global affairs with a minor in global economy, and was formerly a consultant at the UN Security Council's Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. And I understand she'll talk particularly about the issue of women's rights in the humanitarian crisis. So that's the lineup for us. And I would encourage everybody to ask questions. Don't feel confined about my description of the topics, but please do pose your questions as we go in the chat function, and we'll be able to turn to them as soon as we've heard from our 3 panelists, some of whom I think have some time constraints. So with that, unless there is anything else, I would like to turn to the Honorable Fawzia Koofi, who has got her video working. Wonderful. We're delighted to see you. You have the microphone.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for the opportunity to share my experience and the pain of people of Afghanistan moving forward, what should be done. Briefly, I would start with a little bit of before, 15th of August or 11th of September. I start from the time that probably I was just born. When the jihadi group started jihad against the Soviet Union, they choose neighboring countries, Pakistan and Iran, as a base for them to function. And then because of the Cold War, a lot of Western countries, including the United States, gave them enormous level of political support, but also financial support. And the money then was channeled through the intelligence services in the region to empower these jihadi groups. And we know that there were no certain clear benchmarks in terms of human rights, women rights, in each of those jihadi networks. And therefore, the growth of military extremists actually started from then. The jihadi groups actually took over in 1992, and we remember that there was a civil war followed by emerge of Taliban. And of course, when Taliban first came in 1996, which I was also in Afghanistan, and with me, I guess Rukhsar Azami, the student at NYU, also was in Kabul, I guess. Then a lot of people actually in Afghanistan welcomed the emerge of Taliban because there was already a chaos. There was a civil war. And but when Taliban came, there was such a level of misunderstanding about who they are. And of course, in the absence of media or social media or any information flow, it was hard to understand what is their policy, what is their politics, what is their attitudes towards people in general, specifically towards women, until they got to Kabul. And then when we know what went wrong when they got to Kabul. So the beginning of the growth of military extremism actually started in the 70s when the world, was engaged with the Cold War. Now, after 20 years, we are here basically in many areas starting from scratch. When the US negotiated the deal with the Taliban, and the negotiations started from 2013, when the first time Taliban established a political office and the political representation in Doha, Qatar. I think the whole thing started from then, because there was a bilateral negotiation between the US and the Taliban without inclusion of the Afghan institutions or representation from the Afghan system. And as a result, I think even then Taliban will already think themselves as a substitute and as an incoming power, I would say. And that gave them a lot of moral boost. When the deal was signed in February 2020, followed by the start of negotiation in September 2020, I, as someone who has been engaged in negotiation with Taliban from 2019, already could see the difference of Taliban attitude before they signed the agreement and after they signed the agreement. After they signed the agreement with the US, they already were, behaving as a victorious group, because their political calculation was that if they win militarily, it's an absolute win, something that we see now. And if they win through a power sharing, is still a positive step forward for them, because they could go to their foot soldiers and say, as a result of our, jihad and holy war, the US troops were defeated and we came to a political settlement. So in both case scenario, they were the winner, and you could see already in their attitudes that they are not meaningfully, giving time to the negotiation. Of course, in the process of negotiation, there were many other factors involved that gave them further, hope that they will be the only power and they will be the winner. And one of those factors was the April rather announcement of President Biden's absolute withdrawal from Afghanistan without any conditions. We were in the negotiation. We were actually talking issues of substance we were talking about, how a political settlement will look like, and they were proposing an Islamic government. We were discussing what does it mean when they say Islamic government, because we already had an Islamic republic. And according to the constitution of Afghanistan, which for now is, on hold, it is an Islamic structure. No laws, no practices in Afghanistan will be made in contradiction with Islamic principles. So what is their definition of Islamic government when they propose that? Because during the negotiation, we have never heard from them that they want a return of Islamic Emirate. Rather, they were using the term of Islamic government, which was vague in its way, and it needed further elaboration. We were in the middle of that discussion when the announcement happened. And of course, since then, the Taliban were not meaningfully giving time for the negotiation, and eventually, the flee of the former president, the way it happened, and we all know how it happened, paved the way for the hardliner part of the Taliban to enter Kabul. So now the hardliner is in power, and the base of their power, taking over power, is actually military victory. So military victory is not, a valid reason, legitimate enough to internationally recognize a government, especially the things that they continue to do after that when it comes to protection, accountability, transparency, delivering when it comes to governance. For the past 2 months, or a little bit more than 2 months, what they have been doing is, we all know, oppressing and oppressive measures against women, against the religious minorities, the lack of inclusion in the government and inclusive representation, and reports through the media. Of course, there is no strong human rights monitoring in place, and a lot of civil society had to close. They don't allow them to operate. But individual human rights defenders and the social media still continue to play their role in terms of the reporting and advocating. So we know that based on many media and social media report, and also based on my individual contacts with people from across Afghanistan, I know that they continue to oppress people. Even today, in one of the provinces in eastern Afghanistan, they actually killed 3 artists, musicians. So the unfortunate reality is now that their hardliner, the Haqqani network, is more in control and in power, which actually gives little space for their political officer, or those who we hope that they will be, joining force for a different transformed view and adopt based on a transformed Afghanistan. Now, moving forward, I think we have to witness a growth of geopolitics, especially new emerging power, how they will actually substitute the EU and the US when it comes to financial aid. But I think none of those countries will substitute EU and US when it comes to protection of human rights and women's rights, or pursuing those causes. I stop here, and I would be very happy to take questions or participate in the discussion moving forward.
Thank you so much. If you're able to continue to participate, I think we will hold the questions and go to Professor Catton right now.
Thank you, Professor Stewart, and it's really a great honor for me to be here with you today, even though I would have not wanted to be here today on this topic. 20 years after 9/11, what was most important, at least until the 15th of August, is that notwithstanding all the massive mistakes made in the fight against terrorism and what happened after 9/11, at least the Afghani people had been freed from the Taliban. That was, in my view, the most important outcome of this so-called global war on terror, or international fight against terrorism, a global coalition to which, of course, my country of nationality, Italy, participated, and today, I cannot but say that I'm truly ashamed that so many people died in the name of the values that we all protect in our own countries for the purpose of preventing further terrorist attack, of course, but above all with the view of making justice to those human rights treaties that Professor Stewart enlisted at the very beginning of this presentation. So to answer the questions and try to then make a reflection on why did we lose Afghanistan in such a terrible manner on the 15th of August, not unexpected, but unexpected, and then maybe looking forward as ways and means to continue the fight. Well, first of all, no recognition shall be given to the so-called Taliban government or the Taliban regime, to be more proper. It's a totalitarian regime. It's unconstitutional. It concluded a peace agreement with the United States of America in which it was committed itself to bring peace to Afghanistan, but they won the war. So they violated the same treaty that they purported to fulfill in terms of international legal obligation. Of course, here we need to focus on a sharp contradiction. While the United States and also its allies, because all the allies, including my own country of nationality, accepted the agreement that took place in Doha between the Trump administration and the Taliban without the participation of the Afghani government, which is shameful. We need to accept that while the Taliban were negotiating in Doha, they had still the status of a terrorist organization sanctioned under targeted sanctions under a number of United Nations Security Council resolutions, and they continue to do so. So how do we reconcile those two aspects? Simply by admitting our mistake. The Taliban cannot be reduced to a terrorist group. It's much worse than that. It's a totalitarian regime today, and before it was a rebel movement, an insurrectional movement aiming at gaining power over the state of Afghanistan. Much worse than a terrorist group. A terrorist group tries to spread terror wherever they can, but they are desperate because they are weak in the fight against an identified enemy, as Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was immensely weak when it desperately attacked in a criminal way the United States of America on 11 September 2001. Unfortunately, the reaction has been to label each and every organization belonging to the same ideology of groups like Al-Qaeda as terrorist organization. That was not good enough to tackle the threat they were posing to international peace and security. But as the case may be, the contradiction was there, continues to be there. The minimum thing that we should be doing is not legitimizing, not recognizing international peace regime. Of course, as a practitioner of international criminal law who follows very closely the work of the ICC, I'm a little bit surprised by the latest filing that Professor Stewart so well described. Who is the legal entity representing Afghanistan? The legal entity cannot be anybody else but whatever is left of the legitimate government of Afghanistan. That doesn't mean President Ghani, who certainly de facto resigned from his position by escaping abroad, but those civil servants, those members of parliaments, those elected officials who under the constitution are serving a term, they shall be maintained as a privileged interlocutor. They shall not be forgotten, and no recognition shall be given to the Taliban. Of course, leverage shall be used with the Taliban for the purpose of helping the people of Afghanistan, because there is a dire humanitarian crisis. We cannot forget Afghanistan. We must help the civilians in Afghanistan, and food, medicines, minimum basic condition for life must be secured, notwithstanding the fact that there is a Taliban regime. So we need to find ways and means through which to deal with this. One model could be to make use of professional associations, non-profit organizations, de facto entities, association of medical doctors, of lawyers, whoever is on the ground who can channel in a credible way the aid from the international community, the solidarity that the international community must continue to lend. Of course, the problem is corruption. We should not be shying away. Corruption is a transnational crime and is one of the causes of the defeat of the Afghanistan government against the irresistible advance by the Taliban. And here, Professor Stewart, if you allow me to go back, Honorable Kofi went back to the early days of the international funding of the fight against communism and the jihadi groups. Let me go back to at least 2003, February 2003, when President Karzai ratified the Rome Statute of the ICC in the face of mass atrocities, especially those committed by leaders of the Northern Alliance, who in retaliation of course, horrible crimes committed by the Taliban themselves, were part of mass massacres and other gross human rights violations reported by the United Nations system in Geneva and by NGOs. President Karzai at that time recognized that the judiciary of Afghanistan and the prosecutors of Afghanistan were either unable or unwilling or both to bring to justice the person carrying the highest forms of responsibility for these mass atrocities. And by doing so, if there would have been a timely intervention to end impunity in Afghanistan, we might have at least in part prevented some of the same people from becoming the most corrupted leader that we have seen at the end of the collapse of the Afghanistan government. Of course, if there is impunity for mass murder, crimes against humanity, enslavement, like the one also committed by the Taliban, impunity for corruption is a minor, correct? What it is, in the face of enslavement of thousands of boys and girls, what is in the face of putting a lot of young people in front of a wall and shooting them down one after the other? What is about impunity for rape and torture vis-a-vis what has happened thereafter? Massive corruption, testified and especially seen with the escape of the former President Ghani. And I want to stress here the former President Ghani. I think what we need to do now is to support the investigation of the prosecutor of the ICC in the direction of the crimes committed by the Taliban. He mentioned ISIS-K. I'm a bit skeptical about this ISIS-K real capacity to offend human life in Afghanistan. I have a lot of doubts, but let's see. And then onward also, I would believe other crimes committed by those who in the name of governing Afghanistan for 20 years might have committed very, very serious atrocities, the ones for which President Karzai decided in a press statement, notwithstanding the advice of our closest allies at the time, the Bush administration, we are a sovereign nation, we need justice, and we accept the jurisdiction of this court in The Hague. Unfortunately, the court has not stepped up its efforts as it should have, and it's happening now, a bit too late, but I think here I wouldn't put the blame on the prosecutor or on the court itself. The major blame should be on the state parties, major allies of the United States of America, which told repeatedly to the prosecutor for 18 years, don't mess with the war on terror. Major mistake, because if crimes against humanity had been committed, crimes against humanity are higher in the hierarchy of gravity of crimes than crimes of terrorism. So it was a mistake to unduly influence the prosecution in The Hague not to take action against those crimes under international law for which the court had jurisdiction, at least since the 1st of May 2003. Professor, I rest here, and then I will come back to other issues later if it's possible.
Thank you very much, Professor. You've given us a lot to think about, and I hope the basis for a number of questions. We have one already in the chat. I encourage others, but for now, Rukhsar Azmi.
Thank you so much, Professor. I would suggest if we take the question first, because I understand Honorable Kofi had more engagement. So in case if she doesn't have time to answer that towards the end, or if she couldn't stay, so it will give us a chance to have her take on. And then I will continue. If that's an agreement for all of us.
That's fine, because I think the Honorable Kofi may have some time constraints. So we'll turn the microphone back to you.
Thank you, Professor. If there are questions, I will welcome to touch upon the questions. But on the issue moving forward, on the issue of representation and legitimacy, I think the base for legitimacy are a few from what my calculations. You get your legitimacy based on a social contract, which you make through elections with people, or through other political consensus that, even within the principles of Islam, that the Taliban claim, there are certain ways that the power, the base for legitimacy of power is retained. And in this case, the de facto power in Kabul, the Taliban, do not qualify for that. And also when it comes to the world's view, because I know that the US and EU member states are in a difficult position because the Taliban believe that they have defeated US. The EU follow, in most cases, the foreign policy follow each other. We have the emerging powers in the region, China, Russia, of course, continue to keep their embassies. And then, emerging far neighbors like Qatar, they play an interlocutor role, and they have been accommodating Taliban's office for the past 8-7 years. So the geopolitics play its role, but I think there are countries who try to minimize the the atrocities and the crimes that have happened in Afghanistan in the past 20 years, but before that, and continue to happen. And also, I think the world believe that with Taliban in power, they will be able to defeat ISIS, which is a wrong perception. You cannot defeat one military extremist group with another one. And this is something actually, I gave example, this is something happened in 70s. They wanted to defeat through the Cold War Russians through jihadi groups, which at the end, it empowered more radical views in the region. So I think the answer would be to use all the leverage the world has. And there are a few that I will mention. The first thing is the financial support. The financial support that the neighbors gave and the region gave to the Taliban by no means actually is enough, or in any competition, it can actually go to the level of financial support Europe and the US gave or continue to give, and in the past it was donating to Afghanistan. So this is the financial support is the first thing. The international recognition is the second one. We need to put really clear benchmarks when it comes to pursuing our leverage. One benchmark is that there should be an inclusive representative government, which Taliban could be one part of it, but then other political groups, religious minorities, women should meaningfully represent. Now, the thing is, now we have an interim setup, transition setup, which has no basis of legitimacy. So moving forward, if we go for a permanent settlement, I think in that permanent settlement, there should be an inclusive, meaningful representation, restoring constitutional order in order to give a legitimacy to that. This is the thing. The second, respect for rights and liberties. There is a lot of censorship. The mainstream media are not as widely covering issues as they were before because they're under censorship. There is civic activists are being either tortured in the streets, or sometimes the Taliban, because they want to look good in the streets, they chase them in their houses. And we have cases where people who protest and people who work with the previous government, including civil servants, including military officials. Their houses are searched, they disappear and forced disappearance, forced displacement, all of these issues. So civic liberties, respect for civic liberties and fundamental rights, not only in generic statements, but also in practical. This is the second thing. And the last would be meaningfully detachment with other military extremist groups. I don't know how will Taliban do that, because based on the UN report, still Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Taliban, Al-Qaeda, is in Afghanistan, and their kind of claimed victory and defeat of the superpowers have inspired many other jihadi groups that will use Afghanistan soil in the absence of strong institutions to protect the country, that vulnerability to use it. So those three actually are the immediate benchmarks against which we have to, the world has to use its leverage of financial and political recognition. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, ma'am. If I could just interpose one question, and it in a way responds to both you and Professor Catton. To what kinds of pressure, to what kinds of invitations would the current government be responsive? It doesn't seem to me, and I'm far from an expert, that the Taliban regime particularly cares what other countries think. I would suspect they're not particularly interested in whether, for example, the major Western democratic powers condemn them as being undemocratic, because they have their own beliefs. You've suggested they might well be susceptible to leverage in some other areas, for example, financial. But that's one question. And the second one, Professor Catton, you might want to respond to a little bit. What is the Secretary General or the UN going to do with this request? I don't suppose that the Secretary General's in the business of opining on which government in member states is the legitimate one. I suppose the Security Council could do it, although I suspect that's not likely. I suppose the same thing in the General Assembly. So my guess, my 25 cents is on some sort of a non-response, that they will return the question to the ICC, saying that's really up to you in some very polite fashion. We have one question in the chat that asks, what are the criteria for recognizing a state? And I would just answer, John Kim, thank you for that interesting question. Here we're dealing not with recognition of a state. I don't think that anybody's considering that Afghanistan isn't a state or isn't a member of the UN. We're talking about the different issue in international law of how you recognize a government. There are several views there that some members of the international community apply one set of standards and others. I can only say in the case of the United States, for the last number of decades, we have declined to engage in that formal question. We don't go about recognizing government, we go about having relations or not having relations. Other countries do it differently. Interesting question, but a little bit to the side. I didn't want it to go unrecognized, but perhaps before General Kofi has to leave, you might want to have a comment perhaps on what leverage does exist. How are they susceptible to any kind of pressure other than the very hard-nosed kinds of things that have been suggested? I'm going to say hard-nosed, like financial dealing or trade dealing or sanctions or something like that.
Well, I must say that even the sanctions are not properly imposed. The Taliban, we know, although their leaders are in the sanction list, but they have right and left travel and they get high protocol. I must say it's actually the women of Afghanistan that are now under sanction by not being able to travel, being in different refugee asylum camps. And it's not the Taliban actually that are under sanction. We are under sanction. So the Taliban, yeah, they are in the sanction, and in December, the UN Sanction Committee will review it. Actually, the lifting of sanction was until September 12 last year, or the last September 12, 2021. the year that we are in last September, was supposed to be the end of sanction lifting from their political office. And the sanction lifting was for the purpose of negotiation, meaningfully negotiation, and allocating their time into negotiation. But we know that actually they used that sanction lifting very wisely to boost their political position, travel in the region, and they continue to do so. So I think some of their political figures are caring more about international legitimacy, because they know that without international legitimacy, they are not going to survive. So one of their members the other day when I was in Qatar was, one of the affiliates. I wouldn't say members. One of the guys who was close with them, he was like, if the world does not recognize and if there is no financial support, sustainability will be a problem. And it's true, because they are now facing a nation that is not 1996. In 1996, the situation was chaotic. There was a civil war. Institutions were dysfunctional, and they took over from such a system. Now they have actually taken over from a system which was right. There were corruptions, lack of rule of law, culture of impunity, but it was a system that was functional. The three pillars of the government was working, rule of law was functioning, the parliament was active, we had the security forces. So the expectation of people now after 20 years is to that level. They want a government that is able to deliver to them, not a government that in the past 2.5 months, or a de facto government or de facto power, we don't call it government, that in the past 2.5 months, except oppressing people, have not given anything in terms of governance. So I think some of them really are keen and desperate for international recognition. So international recognition is already a leverage that we could go for it. But my experience with Taliban have always come aggressive in what they want to do and what they want to say and propose those proposals. The world basically is very passive. The world diplomacy toward Taliban, including on the humanitarian aid that the world is now is very passive. They don't come with straight conditions. They don't come with benchmarks that against which Taliban should actually be monitored. Even in the humanitarian aid, which is something of course needed and of course should go to the people, poverty and lack of employment, lack of jobs, lack of payment is a major catastrophe that is going to affect the nation in the cold, long winter. But when it comes to international UN, for instance, UN could make the basic thing, could make women inclusion in the aid as a staffer, as a decision maker, as a base for their conditions. But now I know that the Taliban actually come forward with their conditions. So I know Taliban have learned from their negotiations with the US, and they will be very aggressive in pursuing their conditions. And so therefore, I think it's for the world to take the lead and come forward with clear benchmarks. As I said before, 3 at least comes to my mind. There are much more that one could work on this. So one is this recognition. The second is the money. China, Russia, Iran is, these countries have their own, except China, others have their own economic situation. They don't actually substitute the EU and the US financial support. So that is another thing, as I mentioned before. But the worst case scenario would be, the worst case scenario that I am very much afraid is that if Afghanistan's geopolitical situation and the growth of geopolitics and the new, emerging power like Qatar, like other Middle East countries, the situation gets to a place where, the Taliban do not feel the need for other countries in the for Western countries to work with, and something that we already see. I mean, they have been offering the Turkmenistan pipeline, while we know that the security in many parts of Afghanistan is not under the control of Taliban. The fact that there is no incidence of insecurity does not really mean that the security is good, because everything is scattered, and once you start some of those big projects, insecurity will come along with them. So the worst case scenario would be if the kind of leaning towards the region, leaning towards those countries which their human rights situation is already not in a standard, and then the West become irrelevant. So a line of communication to ensure that first and foremost, an inclusive government is formed, because if there is no inclusive, meaningfully inclusive government, the conditions for a civil war is already there. You add the ISIS threat to it, and it's going to be another catastrophe.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate your contributions. If you must leave before, we have 1/2 hour left, so if you have to leave before that, we understand. But right now, I'd like to have Rukhsar, her opportunity to provide her views on these subjects, because she's been nodding eagerly and being very patient. So Rukhsar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's absolutely a pleasure to be part of this panel and to share my views and my take on. As being a consultant to the UN when I was at NYU as part of one of our projects, one of the most sensitive topics that we always came across, it was the definition of terrorism, the definition of a terrorist group. And for all these last 2 decades, we are facing the same issue. And we see the result of that. We could not define the terrorism, and we could not have a specific definition for terrorist groups. And today, that the United States signed a deal with Taliban, and now there are claims that Taliban are not a terrorist group. They are a political group with using violence. This is one of the narratives which I'm coming across again and again, and especially in the United States. This is wrong. This is hypocrisy we are talking in the international community. Because when we are talking about Taliban, they did not, as Honorable Kofi discussed, as Professor David discussed, they did not stand with any of their promises. They did not fulfill any of their promises, and they used violence again and again to achieve whatever they want to achieve. They have committed atrocities in the past, and they will commit atrocities, and they are committing atrocities. There is a huge censorship going on in Afghanistan. There are so many news and incidents that they are not seeing any light of days. And it's just the beginning. It's just the beginning. And our concern, and especially me as someone that I was 8 or 9 years old when Taliban left and the new government started in Afghanistan. And in this last 20 years, I had the opportunity to go to school. I went to law school. I made a career for myself, and I became a target of Taliban. And I haven't seen my family almost for 7 years now. I'm living in exile, and I'm paying the price for it. And now seeing the country going back to where we began, it's heartbreaking. It's unbelievable. And when we are talking, and also in every discussion that we are having regarding Afghanistan, I want girls' education to be the center. I want the girls' education to be at the heart of all the discussion that we have. Because if we want a nation to fail, we will take the rights to have education. And also, we are talking a big part of society. We are talking about half of society in Afghanistan that they will not have right, not just education, to just go out without a mail, or to work in the society, or to be part of a society. And we are talking, and when we are talking about girls' education, if I do a comparison, what we are facing and what we are advocating as a women's rights activist, as a feminist around the world, we are advocating in West and across the world for equal pay, for right of reproductive rights for women, and many, many other issues, which I feel Afghan women in many decades would not even think of reaching there. In Afghanistan, we are fighting and advocating just for the right of going to school, to just have the right to go and get education. And that is called basic human rights. And that's concerning. And continuing with this situation, I would be very candid. I'm not hopeful. Apart from what I have lost, apart from what price that I personally paid, and that's not just my story, that's the story of so many Afghan girls, so many Afghan women, so many of Afghan powerful women that they fight all these 20 years to bring change, and now they don't have a home to call home, they don't have a country to call country. And also every day just seeing that how many people are reaching out to us personally and begging for help, which is the humanitarian side of this whole crisis. It's unbelievable. So in Afghanistan, and also Afghanistan is a country that is highly dependent on international aid. Now Afghanistan cannot access the withdrawal right, the special drawing right from, that's just an example, from International Monetary Fund, because the government is not recognized by international community. And the recognition, as it was a big discussion and big topic in this discussion, that will hinder possibility for so many people there. The rate of poverty, in just a couple months, so many people are suffering from famine, from poverty, and what will be the future of them? And that's concerning. And also, I would like to bring another topic into discussion: the use of drones that now the United States are trying to use as a way to fight terrorism or any attack addressed from Afghanistan. How do we see that? How that ended up for Afghanistan? The suicide attack when the US withdrawal was happening in Afghanistan, and there was a suicide bombing, and then the United States used drone to target that group. It was misinformation. They targeted a wrong group, and so many civilians died in just that one attack. And just take that as an example, how we will see use of drone in Afghanistan, in a country that the United States was there for 20 years. And when they left Afghanistan, they didn't have any intelligence. And that 15 days of withdrawal was catastrophic and a chaos. How that will work? And I would definitely want to have Professor David take on it, because I understand we have had many discussions about AI role in international law and international community, and especially now Afghanistan is a practical example of that. And hopefully Afghanistan will not become another experimental ground for use of drone or AI in the future. I would definitely turn into Professor David and have his take on to it.
Excellent, thank you very much. And if I can add to that question for Professor David, make it a little bit more complicated for you. One of the questions in our chat has raised an issue. It also responds to what Fazia Kofi said, asked. Sanctions against the Taliban, retaliation for their perceived wrongs, their clear violations of human rights, will inevitably have an impact on innocent people. And the example you've just raised, Ruxar, is an example of how responses to perceived attacks or to real attacks often harm individuals. So the broader question is, among the various things that the international community could do, ought not some consideration be taken to how they might harm not just the government or pressure on the government, but also pressure and harm to the innocent civilians? It's a complicated question, but I think you get the underlying issue.
Professor, I think the issue of humanitarian aid is essential here, because by definition, humanitarian aid should be managed in a neutral manner. And we know it, the World Food Program, which is based here in Rome, Italy, is one of the largest in the UN family. The United States is the largest donor, and they are still delivering food regularly to Afghanistan. It's not stopping because the Taliban replaced the legitimate government. So a certain type of basic humanitarian aid has to flow anyway, wherever, regardless of any conditions. It can be, even if a government doesn't want it to be penetrating the national borders, if it's possible, it should. In this case, I don't think the Taliban object to the delivery of humanitarian aid by the World Food Programme or any other neutral humanitarian agency. The problem is how to handle this, therefore not penalizing further the Afghani civilians, but without showing it as a sign of support for the Taliban regime. And of course, it's difficult. But one way to do it is to build, to reduce it from macro support. It's very clear, it's very easy for any security force controlling the territory to stop huge trucks and to find ways and means to then be there to deliver them together with the humanitarian aid workers and show that, oh, this comes from WFP, but it also comes from your brothers in the Taliban government. It's for you, Afghani people. So that's somehow inevitable when macro aid is delivered. At the same time, we know that the Taliban are not as many and as well organized as they've been described. So there are ways and means through which international humanitarian aid agencies could enter. I can make the example of the Italian-based organization that runs, I think, the largest numbers of hospitals in Afghanistan, which is called Emergency. They were already there during the Soviet occupation. They continued to be there in the civil war, and they were there in these last 20 years. They continue to be there. The Red Cross also is there. So clearly the Afghani people knows that these entities are not supportive of the Taliban. So the aid should be channeled to these credible institutions who are certainly not corrupted and not to be doubt about, there is no doubt about the genuineness of their endeavor. What I do believe, however, that legally speaking, the Taliban, of course, Ruxar identified, as I did, tried to do this paradox of being in the global war on terror or anti-terrorism, as the way we call it, and then make a peace deal with a group without which the Al-Qaeda could have not operated. Because if Al-Qaeda didn't have its sanctuary in Afghanistan, Taliban Afghanistan, the attacks would have not taken place from Afghanistan, and maybe not from any other place, probably. So in any case, I think if it was legal to use force in Afghanistan, it was because there was a clear connection between the Taliban regime and Al-Qaeda. But I think what we need to revisit here is the entire toolbox against these violent extremist ideology, which is aimed at creating new totalitarian regime, like the anti-Islamic, anti-state that ISIS created between Syria and Mosul, Iraq. That was a de facto state, of course. It was much more effective than Somalia, which is a state with whom we entertain diplomatic relations. So the fact of the matter is that these are not simply terrorist groups. These are individuals who are perpetrating crimes against humanity as a matter of policy and should be brought to justice. But if we look at the language of the last 2.5 United States presidents, it's not anymore bringing them to justice, but the language is bringing justice to them or killing them. This creates in their distorted ideology of fanatic understanding of what Islam is not, that they would go to paradise if killed by the infidel, whether by a plane or a special troop as the one used to special forces as the one used in the Osama bin Laden operation, or drones or other means. So in other words, they are going to use these killings as a way to multiply their recruitment efforts on the ground. Not to mention when those killings, as Ruxar mentioned, are killing civilian people by mistake, in good faith, because of approximation, because of lack of competence, as the late Professor Bassiouni was stating in his reports, and he was promptly removed from his mandate at the UN in Geneva on the human rights situation in Afghanistan 2005, because he was saying what it was, our mistake in those territories. And we need to revert our hierarchy of values. Fighting impunity for crimes against humanity is much more important than fighting terrorism. and we need to bring them to justice and make trials, not kill them. The doctrine of the targeted killings can be questionable on the international legal plane, and it's certainly illegal, in my point of view, outside active armed conflict theaters. But it's also absolutely ineffective and counterproductive, because the number of people enlisted in these groups that are similar to Al-Qaeda 2001 are 10 or 20 times bigger. We find them in the African Sahel. We find them in North Mozambique. We find them in Somalia, Uganda, and Kenya. We find them in Indonesia. We find them in Southeast Asia. We found them, of course, in the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East. We find them now in power back in Afghanistan. So it didn't work. What has been done so far did not work. We need a major change, because the fight is not over against these groups. These are, in my view, insurrectional movements, rebel groups, and they are. And I would like to see Honorable Fazia and her colleagues in the former parliament and government of Afghanistan to organize a government in exile. And to come to your question regarding the Secretary General, I think you already answered, Professor Stewart. I don't think the Secretary General of the United Nations will be able to tell the International Criminal Court what is the appropriate authority exercising foreign relations on behalf of Afghanistan. And why is that? Because in the face of an illegal government, you have a de facto government on exile that might be blocked by certain permanent members in the Security Council, because we have already seen how China and Russia are behaving towards the Taliban regime. So we might have just a situation of total inaction, and either sides will be vetoed. So there will be a de facto regime exercising territorial control, not the entire territory, I believe, but almost the entire territory. And then there might be, I would hope, better sooner than later, a government in exile that will organize a global campaign for the return of the principle of legality, democracy, and the rule of law in the state of Afghanistan. And final point on sanctions. I do believe we emphasized, and I've heard the people, distinguished colleagues mentioning sanctions as applied by the United States and others. I think it's useful to have sanctions against oligarchs, against people who have a lot of money and financial interests, and they need to have a MasterCard or Visa in their pockets. So when you remove them from those privileges, they feel lost and they feel sanctioned. But I do not believe that this type of financial measures, even travel bans, work with groups that are extremely strong in terms of ideology. They may be also be there for the purpose of making some money, and not all Talibans are really Talibans. Some of them are there because they need to make a living. But at the end of it, maybe because the Taliban leaders are seen to be the victors, and it's easy to go and jump on the car of the victor. But I think overall, we gave too much importance to the financial aspects and too less important to the justice aspects. And in the end, it was about either to extract informations, have extraordinary renditions, treat them as if they were simply accomplices to terrorist organizations, instead of try them for the enslavement of girls and children who have been shipped from Afghanistan into Pakistan, brainwashed, made them the soldiers that then went back and united their efforts with the Taliban forces that won on 15th of August. So we closed our eyes in front of this phenomenon, and I think we missed a major opportunity to have some sort of Dayton effect on the Doha peace talks, because if there were ever peace talks that could have been credible, we would have not wanted, like in Dayton, to have people like Radovan Karadzic or Mladic on the negotiating table. They were indicted war criminals, and we had somebody else who then proved to be a war criminal too, but then nevertheless that gave up certain claims and came up to an accommodation. And a final point that we need to learn, in my view, and apologies if I abuse of the power that I'm given here to speak, is that we have given the leadership in all the international operations from NATO, UN, and during freedom, ISAF and so on, during all these 20 years to military personnel. We did not believe that there could have been a civilian leadership to transition Afghanistan and create the rule of law. And this was our major mistake, because as good as they can be, a military leader cannot really replace the vision that, for example, Karl Bildt brought to Bosnia, or other civilian leader brought into a more credible transition in other regions and situations. Professor, you should unmute yourself, otherwise.
Yes, I'm technologically challenged. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. We have about 10 minutes left, so I was about to invite the Honorable Fawzia Kofi, if she is still there, and has any closing comments, to take 2 minutes to respond to what's been said or offer any other comments.
No, thank you. My apologies if I'm only using the audio, because I'm in the middle of doing another similar. Nowadays with the technology, I think we have a good time going from one webinar to the other one. On the importance of rule of law and justice, I couldn't agree more with Professor David, because I think when the Bonn conference happened in in September 2000, in October rather, or even December, can't remember when, but when the Bonn conference had December 2001 happened, the whole focus was given a security lens. People who have been involved in human rights violation, they were never brought to justice. And in fact, even now, some of those people who have been training others on committing suicide bombing and killing thousands of civilians, ordinary people, they are actually in high-paid jobs. They are one of them is actually the Minister of Interior of the de facto power in Kabul, and the other one was in the negotiation team. Some of them actually committed serious war crimes by committing and training people on suicide bombing. So yes, I think the culture of impunity gave these powers the pleasure of misusing it, and that's why rule of law has become less relevant, and people could play with it. Even the sanctions, removal of sanctions, while my suggestion to the sanction committee of the UN would be that they have to really review and get out of the bureaucracy, because I know some of the people who are in the sanction list of the UN are no longer alive. So I think they should become more relevant and more pragmatic. The International Criminal Court, they opened a file on Afghanistan, which was very general. I think they now looking at who is holding those key positions in Afghanistan. They should become more functional. These institutions become more functional. They need to become more relevant, more functional. The Taliban announced amnesty, general amnesty, while in reality, it's actually the people of Afghanistan who should decide whether they want to announce amnesty or not, because I think the healing process is very, very important. The victims of war need to be listened to. There is no one in Afghanistan that has not been a victim of war. And Rukhsar just mentioned, being NYU student, she too is also a victim of war. I was in the negotiation with my hand in cast, being wounded by the attack of Taliban. Everyone in Afghanistan is a victim of war, and that's why you have a traumatized nation. Therefore, I think the International Criminal Court, the UN Sanction Committee, they need to become more relevant. Now we know that there is a special rapporteur that will start its work from March next year. The EU investigation, a proposed investigation mission to Afghanistan was defeated by the neighboring countries in the UN Human Rights Council. in the absence of those institutions, my concern is that human rights violation become a norm. There are a lot of countries in the region who want to actually normalize the situation. So human rights respect in Afghanistan is an exception, but human rights violation is a norm. And that's why you see these people, the more you kill, the more power you gain. And that's heartbreaking, as it was mentioned. So yes, we need to actually, and now is the time for accountability, for transparency, for rule of law.
Thank you. Rukhsar, do you have any closing comments?
Yes, Professor, thank you so much. As it was mentioned so many times about justice, I believe one of the options that we have at the international community, at disposal of international community, would be using the complementary jurisdiction of International Criminal Court. The investigation is opened already. And now is the time to take advantage of the complementary jurisdiction and try to investigate some of the atrocity crimes that they are being committed in Afghanistan by Taliban, by other groups, or even by powerful state members of the international community. And that's the way to move forward. If there is no justice, I don't see how we set an example for the future. And also the way we deal with Taliban right now, it will set a precedent for a lot of other terrorist groups, how they will think about their moves forward. Because if we are not taking if we don't draw a hard line how we are dealing with Taliban right now, it will be a clear indication and signal for many, many other terrorist groups that if they use force, if they kill more people, there will be some rewards at the end of them for it.
Professor David, any last comments?
Yes, no, I saw two fantastic questions from Professor Leila Sadat and Jennifer Traham. So here I need to try to answer. Professor Sadat asked, how can this message of justice, of ending what happened in 20 years, be communicated in a way that officials will listen? I think we need to be blunt and say when we were wrong for years and years. I have heard United States government officials defending the legality of the policy of targeted killings. And I didn't have any words, because of course we kill people after that, if you have the death penalty, after they've been found guilty beyond reasonable doubt, or maybe in extraordinary situations when we want to stop them from activating themselves into attacking us, an imminent attack, a direct threat, and so on. So I think this policy of eliminating people is a symbol of revenge, and it's really sending the message that whoever can kill more will win, and the Taliban won. So I think the message has to be very clear and put on the table for a reversal and coming back to where we were in the 1990s. And then conditionality. Professor Traham says something that is very interesting, and I would love that the old idea of conditionality would work in a situation like the one we are looking at. I'm afraid it's too late. Maybe this conditionality to respect human rights, to respect the rule of law and justice, the principles of justice and so on, should have been used with the Karzai government, with the Ghani government. I mean, we should have been much more forceful, instead of just helping them in every possible way to securize them, to create their own system of government. And those conditionalities would have been supported by activists like Rukhsar and Honorable Kofi and I believe most of the parliamentarians. My organization, Parliamentarians for Global Action, organized the first meeting between the first prosecutor of the ICC and 3 Afghan MPs as early as in 2008. And I was shocked to learn that it was the first ever meeting that the prosecutor had with Afghani officials when Afghanistan had joined in 2003. Much more should have been done. Instead of our governments who give development cooperation to Afghanistan, instead of telling the prosecutor to do nothing in Afghanistan, we should have incentivized him to go into Afghanistan and look into evidence for mass atrocity crimes. unfortunately, we caved in, we compromised. So conditionalities can work when there is a government that is interested in receiving certain structured aid. I'm not sure, and I hope to be wrong, of course, that this will be a tactic that may work with the Taliban.
Excellent. I want to thank all three of our panelists for an engaging and very thoughtful discussion. I'm not sure that we have any one answer, but drawing on my own background as a former government attorney and also now as a professor, I'm thinking, wouldn't it be a wonderful examination question to put to the seminar, draft the memorandum for the Secretary General on how to respond to the request from Pretrial Chamber number 22, or write the memorandum for your country's ambassador to the United Nations on how to propose a concrete step forward in solving or addressing this problem. In either event, you'd have to come up with some sort of answer to many of the questions that you've raised. We are out of time. I applaud your contributions. It's been a delight to be here with you, and thanks so much for contributing to International Law Weekend. I think we are finished. So, adieu.